wasn't going to talk on this subject, but after the events of this past week, um, you know, I guess being broken into 2 times in 10 years, that, probably is not a bad average, but it's easy to give into fear. We're seeing on the news and everywhere, it just seems like everyone seems to be frightened. So I thought that would be a good thing to talk about. And I thought that would be a good thing to talk about. My sound person said my mic wasn't on. Wish we could just turn it on from back there, but then she'd turn it on, throw it at me, and I'd have to catch it. So, but, you know, we saw someone break into a church, and like I said, the one question that every police officer and the utility guys all said is, who breaks into a church? Well, we live in a world where people are run by fear. They're growing despondent. They lost hope. That's who would break into. So today I want to look at the topic of fear, as well as how we as Christians should respond to fear and fearsome things. And, I was just thinking of this as I started writing this message on Thursday afternoon. Today we're faced with fear all around us. I bet if we went around, everyone here would have something that they're frightened of. It might be spiders and snakes. It might be quicksand. It might be a thing that you can't even see, a virus that strikes terror in people's hearts and divides people, destroys relationships. That person next to you could be a carrier, a killer hidden in plain sight. People are frightened. These people, that we see, are making such a big deal, and COVID is a big deal. But the other side of that coin is God is in control. Our economy is another thing that we see often about subject of fear. Better order now. Christmas you may not get it in Christmas time. Hyperinflation is coming. These are the things that you see in the news. The government is out to get you. Do you know what they're doing behind the scenes? I actually had someone tell me that the COVID shot had GPS trackers in it. I said, will it work with my phone? But again, it's fear that's being spread. And fear in its own self is not a bad thing. It's a natural response. If you see a bear, I'll say I have to be like half a mile away, you're going to turn around and go in the opposite direction. If you don't, you're crazy. Fear is good. It's meant there to protect you. But fear can also be used to manipulate you. It can be used to scare you and drive you where you don't want to go. I know of a woman whose whole life revolves around the fear of the unknown. Their homes have redundant systems. They have a generator in case the power goes out. Well, that's okay. I have a generator. Actually, I tried to start it last week and it won't start, so I got to be working on that this week. But what if that generator doesn't work? Well, this person has a backup to the backup generator, just in case. They have stocks of food. They don't leave their house because it's crazy out in the world. The world is full of dangerous people. And everything that is in the world scares them. This person has essentially stopped living in order to survive. In the Bible, we see different kinds of fear, and I just want to look at two things. And again, fear is not always a bad thing. The Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's a good kind of fear. We don't want to be a sinner in the hands of an angry God at all, as we're going to see today. God sometimes uses fear to call out people not worthy of his kingdom. So, remember when God delivered the Israelites from the Egyptian slavery? He took them to a place called the Promised Land. But he took them through, remember, he didn't take them directly there, right? To get from Egypt to the Promised Land shouldn't have taken as long as it took. He took time. He took them through a wilderness, which is a nice way of saying he took them through a desert. And if you could sum up the general attitude of the Israelite people in the wilderness, what would you say? One word. Grumbling. Another word. Stubborn. Okay, stubborn. What else? Afraid. You thought they were afraid?
The people that were going in there?
That were walking through the wilderness, the Israelites.
I think they had to have been a little afraid. They didn't know what was coming.
Well, God was leading them.
They knew they were protected.
Unsure? How about not content? Yeah. How about unbelieving? You know, part of it had to do with their fear of the unknown. You know, how many times did they ever hear of a God rescuing a whole people, a whole nation of people? You know, they would use the Egyptian gods. Because remember, they were in Egypt for 400 years as a people. I don't know how many generations that would make. Probably like 5 or 6. But whoever heard of a God that did that? He walked them through the Red Sea. You know, how were they going to survive? And was this just a gag, you know, or a trick played by Moses and Aaron? But with the reality of the wilderness around them, it caused them to fear that God had brought them out of Egypt, where they were slaves, to die in the wilderness. You see, their fear distorted in their minds what type of God he was. Remember, God was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, people who they all knew. They were directly descended from them, and they were kept separate. Remember, that was one of the things that upset the Egyptian people, or Egyptian Pharaoh. They wouldn't intermarry. So, the Israelites were literally purebred up from Abraham down. And God delivered them. He was the God who heard their cries when they were still slaves, and he was the one who sent a deliverer named Moses to rescue them. And it made no sense God would take them from slavery and kill them in the desert. But that was one of their common complaints. Oh, when God brought us here, why did he bring us here? Just to kill us in the desert? But not only did their fear cause them to forget or distort who God was and what he had done for them in the past, things that he did for their good, fear also led them to distort what their past and reality had been. In Numbers 11:5, the Israelites are saying, "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." And in Exodus 16:3, it says, "And the people of Israel said to them, 'Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out to the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.'" They remembered their past. If you want to say rose-colored glasses, you can, but I think they must be a double prescription of that. Because I don't know of any slaves that would be treated where you just sit around and eat from the meat pot. Remember why they cried out to God to deliver them from slavery. Slaves don't have all kinds of food, nor do they sit around. But their fear of where they were going in the wilderness caused them to distort what was happening in their past. But through this wilderness, despite their grumbling and complaining, God was faithful. God brought them to safety. He fed them. He provided them with water. Generally, it was done miraculously. And God assured them that they were going to a land that God had promised to his ancestors. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 1. Deuteronomy 1. Moses is relating how he told the people to enter the land. Because what happened is, as they were going along, they came to the promised land. After going through their wilderness experience, after dealing with some treachery along the way and betrayal, and lots of complaining, and I think God put up with some of the complaining because he understood that they were going to complain, that they weren't used to this, that they didn't know. You don't go from slavery to free instantly. And so Moses in Deuteronomy 1 starts relating how he told the people to enter the land and take possession of it, because God told them he was giving them the land. You don't have to work for a gift. You don't buy a gift, hence the name given to you. So starting in verse 19, it says, "Then we set out from Horeb and went through all that great and terrifying wilderness that you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, as the Lord our God commanded us. And we came to Kadesh Barnea, and I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up, take possession, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has told you. Do not fear or be dismayed." God's command was not enough for the Israelites. Moses must have seen it on their faces as he looked out and said, "Go on, take the land. We're here. God told you to." But instead of standing on the promises of God, the Israelite people as a nation blinked. Instead of taking God's word for it, they want to be sure for themselves with their own eyes. In verse 22 it says, "Then all of you came near me and said, 'Let us send men before us, that they may explore the land for us and bring us word again of the way which we must go and the cities into which we shall come.'" So they decide, hey, we're going to send men to see it for ourselves on a spy mission, to see what's waiting for us. By asking such a thing, they were literally saying, we don't believe that the God who brought us here is faithful to his promises. God said, go up, take possession, do not fear or be dismayed. But the Israelites were saying, well, that's nice, but we have a better idea. We want to explore the land first. Now, from a military point of view, that's a great idea. Scouting the land is a great idea. Gathering intelligence before an assault, great idea from a human perspective. Bringing back trophies to display to inspire victories, great idea from a human perspective. But God had already told them, I'm giving you this land. All they had to do is go and take it. But they were afraid. They let fear of the unknown rule them. And by doing so, they displayed true and faithless hearts. Let's flip over to Numbers 13. It's off to the left, one book. Numbers 13. We see an account of how the spies were sent. God said, okay. Now, of course, remember, God knows the end from the beginning. He knew how this is all going to play out. In verse 1 of Numbers 13, it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel." He keeps emphasizing that, I think because he's giving them a gift. "From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." He didn't say send, the little schmo guys. He's saying send people with power and authority to go and see how great it is. And so Moses sent them into the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them men who were heads of the people of Israel. So God agrees. He says, take them. They're described as leaders, princes, or chiefs. In other words, these were the cream of the crop. These were men in the know. They went out and spied the land, it says, for 40 days. And by the amount that they covered, that's 500 miles they went. We're talking about Caleb. And 500 miles, I don't know if that's like halfway down to Virginia, or it's down to Virginia or so. They even visited Hebron. Anyone know what was that Hebron that would have been important that they visited? Okay, good, I'm not the only one. There are graves there of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, and Jacob. They were all buried in Hebron, and they could go there. Do you think seeing the graves of their patriarchs inspired them? For some, probably, but for the majority, it doesn't appear so. And they come back and they have a committee. So a committee, I've heard, is defined as a group of people who individually can do nothing and collectively decide nothing can be done. This is so true as we see the result of when the spies come back. And they tell the people what the land was like. So they start off, they probably go good news, bad news. And people are like, oh, tell us the good news. Okay, here's the good news. They describe a cluster of grapes. In Numbers 13:23, it says, and they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between two of them. They also brought pomegranates and figs. Can you imagine a thing of grapes that big? I mean, I get happy when I see a little thing of like that. In verse 27, it says, and they told us, we came to a land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. They're saying, yes, this land flows with milk and honey. The fruit is fantastic. It's an amazing place. This matched the description that God gave Moses at the burning bush. Remember when God is sending Moses, he appeared in a bush that was on fire but didn't get consumed. And in Exodus 3, verses 7 and 8, it says, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I guess they weren't sitting around pots eating meat. So I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. He doesn't try and hide it. He says, yeah, this is the land that these people live in, but I'm giving it to you. Now, some people will say, well, why did the Israelites come in and kill all those people? What kind of God does that? Well, the kind of God that gave these people 400 years to turn around and repent and come to him. When they didn't, the land was theirs, and God knew this. So let's see. The land is exactly like the land that God described to him. A land literally flowing with milk and honey. And it was this God who said, I'm going to deliver you from slavery, and he did. It was this God that allowed Moses to perform miracles, and he did. It was this God who brought them through the Red Sea on dry ground, and they were all there, and they participated. It was this God who was feeding them daily with manna in the morning, quail at night, and water from rocks every day as they journeyed out into the wilderness. It was this God who had promised to drive the people out of the land of Canaan. Let's move over to Exodus 23. Keep going to the left. Leviticus and then Exodus. Exodus 23. Verses 27 to 31. God's saying, I will send my terror before you. Remember, he says, go up and take possession. But this is how he's giving them a warning and saying, don't worry, I'm going to go before you. I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of that land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. A lot of things there. Number one, Israel never got to those borders. The Euphrates River is over in Iran, for number one, and they never went that far. You know, God said, I'm not going to drive them all out at once, but I'm going to do it bit by bit so you can acclimate, so you can take over as you go. But he says, I will drive them out, not you. The God of the deliverance said that he would drive them all out, which seemed great until the spies got back And they said, okay, now what's the bad news? Well, in Numbers 13, verses 28 to 29, it says, however, they said, after saying about how great the land was as far as the resources go, however, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Their words had a terrifying effect on people. We hear descendants of Anak, and anyone here who the descendants of Anak is? Giants. There are giants in the land, is what they're saying. Big, bad, terrible giants in the land. He's saying, and we're familiar with one of the descendants of Anak. His name is Goliath, that we're going to look at a little bit later. But Caleb is one of the spies who said, okay, yeah, there are giants in the land. Yeah, there's all kinds of people. But in Numbers 13, verse 30, it says, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Caleb is just one of these guys. Later on, when they do come back to the land the second time, he's 80-some-odd years old, and he goes, let's go, I'm going to take my mountainside. And he led the attack. Caleb's one of these guys that just probably never gets you old. But the other spies are like, oh, no, they're shook. In Numbers 13, verses 31 to 33, it says, then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who were from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers seemed to them. Not only did the other 10 spies not want to go into the land, go up and possess the gift that God had promised them, but they were so frightened of what they had heard and seen, they literally wanted to undo what God had done for them in Egypt. Flip over to Numbers 14. If you're in Numbers 13, it's the next book over. So Numbers 14, sorry. Verses 1 to 4. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry. Remember, this is about 2 million people. Just raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in the wilderness. So now they've added another one. Oh, it would have been better to die in Egypt. It would be better to die in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. They literally want to undo the gift of freedom that God had given them. And not everyone agreed. The two of the spies, of the 12 spies, said, wait a minute, guys. In Numbers 14, verses 5 to 9, it says, then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into that land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. 2 of the spies stand out and speak out, declaring, it's a wonderful land. just as God described it. He didn't hide anything from us. They also warned the people that not do it is to rebel against God. And to fear the people of the land is equal to that. And I love what Caleb says. They are bread to us. You know, yes, they may look fearful, but they'll be bread for us. We'll just eat them alive. You know, but their words fell on deaf ears. Not only did now the Israelites want a new leader, but in verse 10 of Numbers 14 it says, "Then all the congregation said to stone them with stones, but the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of the meeting to all the people of Israel." They were all set to stone Joshua and Caleb, and they were only saved because the glory of the Lord came out of the tabernacle. But regardless of how they acted out of fear, their rebellion did not go unnoticed by God, who was all set to wipe them away. He's like, God said in Numbers 14, verse 12, "I will strike them with a pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they." He's saying this to Moses, saying, look, I'm sorry, we're not going to go do this. We're going to wipe them all out, and we're going to start again. And Moses intervened for the Israelites, and God relented. He pardoned them, but he still was going to punish them. And the punishment was going to be harsh. In Numbers 14, starting in verse 28, God said, "Say to them, 'As I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing, I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and of all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones, who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead body shall fall in the wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead body lies in the wilderness. According to the number of days at which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this will I do to all this wicked congregation who has gathered together against me. In this wilderness you shall come to a full end, and there you shall die." God says, yes, you've been pardoned, but you're going to get punished. Notice in their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the place that they kept claiming God was trying to kill them in, they were going to learn a lesson, and the lesson was for the next generation. That they were in this wilderness because of their previous generation, a generation that balked at the belief in their God. And with every funeral in that wilderness, God literally was making their fears a reality. This prompted a great fear in the Israelites when they heard the voice of God. The fear of being an enemy of God and his punishment. The fear of the shame that they would bear for 40 years in the wilderness until they were literally all dead in the wilderness. They learned nothing. Instead of accepting their punishment, their fear caused them to yet again disobey God and rebel. In verse 39 of Numbers 14, it says, "When Moses told these words to the people of Israel, the people mourned greatly. And they rose early in the morning and went up to the heights of the hill country, saying, 'Here we are. We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned.' But Moses said, 'Why are you now transgressing the command of the Lord, when that will not succeed? Do not go up, for the Lord is not among you, lest you be struck down before your enemies. For there are Amalekites and Canaanites are facing you, and you shall fall by the sword, because you have turned your back from following the Lord, and the Lord will not be with you.' But they presumed to go to the heights of the hill country, although neither Ark of the Covenant or of the Lord nor Moses departed out of the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in the hill country came down and defeated them and pursued them even to Hormah. Now, they say, okay, all right, well, I guess we can try taking the land. We're going to kind of force God's hand. He said that he's not, that we're supposed to wander with us. We're going to show him. We're going to just go do it ourselves. But it was too late. God's judgment had already been passed. The sentence just hadn't been carried out yet. And fear caused them not to accept God's gift, but it also caused them to disobey the Lord again and try and do it without him. And you know what? The Israelites without the Lord couldn't do it. In that sense, they were right. Here we see how fear affects God's children. Number one, fear caused the people to distort who God was and what he had done for them. Not just once, but many times. Miracles that they saw with their own eyes, miracles that they participated in. Yet the fear of what they were told to do caused them to forget the purpose of what they were going through. Fear ultimately led the entire people to scoff at the gift of God, their freedom and the land, but not only scoff at all that God did, but throw it back at him and reject him. Fear caused them to rebel against God, even though they were warned not to do this. And that rebellion had consequences that they paid for with their lives. We also saw that fear is progressive. It started with 10 men, leaders of the tribes and family, 10 men who were fearful and discouraged by what they saw, in spite of what they were told by God, who were more concerned about what their eyes told them, and their fear spread to literally 2 million people overnight. And that fear became doubt, and doubt became unbelief, and unbelief became rebellion against God. And when the next generation came, they came into the land, and they possessed much of the land. 40 years later, as God promised. And they didn't take all the land. Like I said, they didn't make it to the Euphrates River. No, their fear of not having a godly judge was the next thing that we see, or we're going to look at today. There's other things that they were fearful of, but remember they weren't ruled by kings because God was supposed to be their king. And what they had were judges who would talk between God and them. Well, it got down to Samuel, and Samuel had sons, but they weren't very good sons. And so they started to demand a king, just like everyone else had. Samuel got very upset with them, but God interceded. Now flip over to 1 Samuel, off to the right. Right before 2 Samuel, if you hit Kings, go back to the left. 1 Samuel 8. 1 Samuel 8, yep. 1 Samuel 8, and we're going to look at verses 6 to 9. But the thing, they demanded a king, displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them, and show them the ways the king who shall reign over them." Notice God looked at the demand for a king as their rejection of him. And even though they were warned what a king would be like, they pushed for it anyways, and they got King Saul, who was not a godly king, who was petty and jealous, impatient and fearful, and one who ultimately God rejected on multiple occasions. And instead of repenting and confessing, King Saul made excuses. God would select another king, a young shepherd boy named David. But first, God would give the Israelite people an example of what a godly person can do in the face of an overwhelming adversary. He brings one of the descendants of Enoch to the forefront, and his name was Goliath. We see the Israelites in this next cameo of what a fear of man looks like. And it wasn't just any man. He was a giant. Literally 9'9" tall. I think he'd have to bend his head a little bit in this room. I think. I'm not sure. We'd have to measure it. And I'm going to use the NLT because it puts his dimensions in measurements that we can understand. But in 1 Samuel 17, verses 4 to 7, it says, Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was like a heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. This guy was huge. Just his coat alone weighed 125 pounds. And for those of you that know Terra, that's like, I would bet, like 1.25 Terras. He was fearsome, and he knew it, and he was proud. What made him even more scary, it's one thing to have a giant on your side, but when you're facing a giant, that can be very scary. And Goliath didn't just stand there. In verses 8 to 12 of 1 Samuel 17, it says, Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight, he called. I am the Philistine champion. But you are only servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. And if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Okay, so now you have this 9 foot tall, and we'll just say, what do you think, Ed? 9 foot ceilings here? Oh, is it? Okay. All right.
This is about 9 feet.
This is
My
the,
house is 9.5 feet. This is about the same.
okay. So around, let's say the height of that poster. That's a big guy. And his effect was fear, terrified. And Saul, remember when Saul was picked, he was considered, they picked him partly because he was a head taller than everyone else in Israel. So he wasn't a short guy, but he'd be looking up to Goliath. And by most thinking, it should have been King Saul as the champion to stand up and fight the giant, but he didn't. Instead, he just sat there and waited. He wanted to see if someone else would jump up and, fight a 9 inch tall giant. And it must have got embarrassing as the days turned to weeks and no one came forward. And yet Goliath kept his taunting up. In verse 16, it says, For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. Every morning you wake up, you'd be waking up to this guy, mocking your army and crying out to you, come on, let's have someone fight. There was no light. You went to bed, and he'd be sitting there saying, good night. No one's still come out to fight. It was like a constant drain on the spirit. Each morning, this literal giant would reinforce to the Israelites the impossibility of any of them beating him. Fear is not only progressive, but it will sap the life out of people or an army. And that's the stage that God set and brings David to. David was sent by his father to bring food for his brothers. So in verse 23 to 26, it says, As he talked to them, that's David talking to his brothers, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up and out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. The effect of 40 days of this taunting had the men frightened, and they just fled. They didn't want to hear it anymore. They were already defeated. The Israelites were not willing to relate why they were so afraid. The men of Israel said in verse 25, Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. So David's saying, then they say, well, yeah, the king's going to make anyone rich that's going to fight this guy and win. Notice they share that now King Saul isn't just waiting. He's actively participating, saying, hey, I'm going to give you a lot of riches. You can have my daughter. And in fact, your whole family's household won't have to pay taxes ever again. And this got David's ear, and he verifies this, what he heard from other men. And in verse 26, and David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David says that every Israelite soldier and king should have known in the first place. You see, David didn't see a giant, but he saw an enemy of the Most High God who was defying God's will through his armies. David's words may have seemed like bragging, but they were instead the words of a person confident in their God. David wasn't saying, oh, look at me, look how holy I am. No, he's saying, this is guys defying the king, our God. Why are you letting this happen? I thought of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were told to bow down, and they went. He said, I'm going to throw you in the fire. And remember their response. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he shall deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. David understood that God could deliver Goliath into David's hands, but even if God chose not to, that was okay too, because he was God and David wasn't. And as David was saying this in verse 31, it says, when his words that David had spoke were heard, and they repeated them to Saul, and he sent for him, and Saul said to David, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. So David's brought before Saul, because he's heard this, and I'm sure Saul is thinking, this guy's probably going to be a good fighter, it's going to be a good, and he sees a boy, a 17-year-old boy. We know he couldn't be 18, because in 18 he'd be serving in the army. So he's at least 17. And Goliath was a man who's been trained in war. But David's like, don't worry, I'll take care of it. Again, not because he's proud of himself, but he's proud in his God. David gives him his resume. He says in verse 34 to 36, but David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there was a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose up against me, I caught him by the beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Again, David isn't making this about him. He's making this about God. And in verse 37 it says, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And so Saul said, go, and the Lord be with you. Well, I guess that was enough for King Saul. He said, well, he saw David's faith. And it must have been a rebuke of Saul. Because remember Samuel always said, why aren't you faithful? And Saul just did things like he felt like. David's words must have reminded Saul of Samuel. And being a man of what he saw, he gives permission for David to fight. And he tries to give him, at least in his eyes, a fighting chance. He puts his armor on David. And it must have looked hilarious because remember, Saul's very huge and David's still just a boy. And David's like, I can't trust in this armor. He's trusting in his God. In verse 40 it says, "Then he took the staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine." And I always found interesting, he chose 5 stones. He only needed 1. Do you know how many brothers Goliath had? 4. So 5 stones, and 4 of his, all 5, so 5 of Goliath's family were all killed by either David or by his people. I always found that to be interesting. Was David a prophet to say that? In verse 41 it says, "And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And then the Philistine looked and saw David, and he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance." Goliath is not impressed. He wanted a man to fight. He wanted a soldier to come out and fight him. Here's a guy not even wearing armor, and he has a wooden pole and a sling. It's clear that David is not, and Goliath thought the Israelites were mocking him, saying, "Oh, we'll take you on with this." Verse 43, "And the Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog that you should come to me with sticks?'" He's looking at David's staff as a stick, And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." But David wants to make sure Goliath knows who he's fighting. In verse 45, "Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. And I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." David says, "Goliath, you're not fighting a handsome 17-year-old. You're fighting the Lord of this God. You're fighting Jehovah." He uses uppercase Lord, means Jehovah, God's personal name. He says, and you know what? The battle's already won. You've already been delivered. And needless to say, it didn't go well when Goliath rushes. In verse 48, it says, "When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his head. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw this, that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shurim as far as Gath and Ekron. Now with the giant distraction removed, the men of Israel acted, and they chased after them. The lesson here is that fear has a lot to do with our focus. The Israelites were afraid because they trusted their eyes. They saw a 9-foot-tall giant. Who does that? Who has a 9-foot-tall giant? And did you notice the giant wasn't afraid? Because he didn't know anything about the God he could not see. Perhaps Goliath didn't see God in the face of the Israelites. He saw a fearful reaction of Israelites, probably the same reaction that any time Goliath went on the battlefield, because not many people had giants. And every time Goliath got on, he'd see the same reaction. And he saw it in the Israelites. And after 40 days of repeatedly saying this over and over and taunting them, had they really believed in God, would they have been afraid as they were? Wouldn't they have been more like David was? Perhaps it would have made a difference to Goliath if he saw the people saying, "Okay, which one do you want to take?" "Well, any of us can take you if God is on our side." And like the other Israelites, King Saul was afraid. but seemed to see something in this young man, David. Maybe he thought, hey, if God is very with him, maybe he could do it. But if not, maybe he'll be a martyr and, will take revenge in his death. But only David seemed to trust in something besides his eyes. And he knew that the God of Israel, a God he could not physically see, but whom he knew was his salvation and deliverance when he fought bears and lions. After all, he was a young man, not a soldier. He was not an expert in war. Fear is progressive. Today it still leads to unbelief. Unbelief is still rebellion against God. We see men and women claiming to be Christians, wanting to do things their way instead of God's. God says that you are dead in your trespasses. Dead people can't make decisions. They can't move. They can't do anything. God offers the only gift of salvation, and it's free. Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing. It is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one can boast. This is a free gift to you and I. But it cost God his son's life. A gift needs to be accepted. Just as God offered the promised land to the Israelites who actually saw many of God's miracles, but who became so focused on everything but the gift that they rejected it. Instead of people accepting God's gift today of salvation, people say, wait, we might have a better idea, God. We need to do something to earn it. Let's go to church and be a Christian. Get baptized. Say a prayer. Get your head wet. Give other people a reason to come to church. They not only want to keep it simple, they want it easy. But that's not what Jesus said. It doesn't work that way. You can do many great works, but if you haven't accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, it means nothing. Jesus said, in fact, in Matthew 7:21-23, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And on that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, or cast out demons in your name, or do mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Mighty works done without God are a rebellious act of animated dust. Today, fear still taunts many Christians and attempts to draw our eyes off of God. We may not have a literal giant taunting us every morning or evening, but we have something close. It might be the news. It might be social media. And with each report or post, Christians are taunted. Do you really believe that there's a God, that he's in control of everything? He's in charge of this mess? Many become fearful. And no, it doesn't happen all at once. But little by little, people's faith becomes more and more on the things that they can do or say. Oh, let's organize our political parties. Oh, let's do this. Let's do that. It's about God and God alone. If you think God needs your political parties to get something accomplished, your God is too small. Don't depend on what your eyes see or what your abilities are. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. David knew he was going to face a giant. And based on outward appearances, he didn't have a prayer. But he had a God, and that was enough. Many Christians have become fearful and scared. They cling to this life. At missions, we talk about the 1040 window, where 2/3 of the earth's population exists, governed by people, for the most part, that are anti-Christian. And instead of Christians lining up to be martyred there, we try to do things in secret. Oh, we'll get native passes because then they're more lenient with them. Let someone else risk their lives. We'll stay at home. We'll provide the funds. And that's fine if God's doing that. But the Christianity was a Christianity built on the blood of saints. That didn't mean that, that we'll pay someone else to do it. Where are the Christians like the early ones who turned the world upside down, which is what we're going to look at next week? Where are the Jim Elliots today, who 9 years before he gave his life said he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose? Where are the Christians who are willing to even go out into the world? Maybe you don't want to go to 1040 window. Go to your neighbor and share your faith. Live the gospel before them. So what are we supposed to do when we're confronted by fear? Everyone faces fear at some point or another. We need to turn them over to God and then let them go. 1 Peter 5, verses 6 and 7. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Notice he doesn't say some of your anxieties. Keep the ones you can handle. No, all of them. And let them go. When we do, it will be like Caleb said in Numbers 14:9. Remember, I just love that sentence. Only do not rebel against God and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. I love that. We can eat up all the things that cause us fear when the Lord is with us. Bread will make you stronger, just as testing and trials are meant to. Fear can make you stronger. When you step out into it and God acts through you, your faith will become stronger. So what do? Remember whose child you are. If you are truly born again and you're not just a Keno, a Christian in name only, 1 John 4:4 says, little children, you are from God and have overcome them. For he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. We know that God is in each true believer. And if Satan attacks you, what's the most he can do to you? The most he can do is kill you. And then it's heaven. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew 10:28, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who cannot destroy both soul and body in hell. Death should not worry a true believer. We are children of the living God who's as real today as he was back then. We are people who should be known by our love. John 13, verses 34 and 35, Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you, and you are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. The love we have for brothers and sisters in Christ should be evident. Love is what a Christian is supposed to be all about. Remember, Jesus said in John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And remember his two big commandments? They boiled everything down for us. He says, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second is love like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So if a person refuses to obey God's commandments, he doesn't love them, regardless of what they say with their mouth. And here's the beauty. When we love like that, an amazing thing happens. 1 John 4:18 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. What a promise. There's only one thing that we should be afraid of. Paul mentioned it. You know, I always am amazed when you read in 1 Corinthians about all the beatings and whippings and things that Paul went through for the course of Christ. You know, it's easy to think, oh, that man must have gotten frightened. But there's only one thing he wrote that said he frightened him. And it's found in Galatians 2:2. Paul writes, I went there because God revealed to me that I should go. While I was there, I met privately with those considered to be leaders of the church and shared with them the message that I had been preaching to the Gentiles. I wanted to make sure that we were in agreement, for fear that all my efforts had been wasted and I was running the race for nothing. The thing that frightened Paul was that all the things he was doing was being wasted. That's a good kind of fear. When we get to the end of our lives, are we going to look and say, I've been poured out like a drink offering. I've given every little thing I can. Or are we going to sit there and say, I'm afraid, I wish I could have done more. Could I have done more? You know, fear can suck the life out of any believer, and we can't allow it. If you see a brother or sister being discouraged or suddenly saying, well, let's talk politics. No, don't talk politics. Politics have no place in this church or any church. Let's talk God. What can God do? When you vote on Tuesday, look at what they believe. If they believe things that don't line up with the Bible, don't vote. And someone actually told me this, and I can say it because I'm not here. But they said, well, if I voted for people who espouse Christian beliefs, well, they'll never win. It doesn't matter if they win or not. It matters that you are standing by your principles that Christ gave you. That's the important thing. Win and losing political, God can do, if he can kill a giant, if he can give a land to a people, he can put whoever is in power that he wants. And we have to remember that. Let's pray. Oh, Heavenly Father, we do thank and praise you for who you are, Lord. Let's never forget how powerful you are, how strong you are. Let's cling to the rock of your salvation, Lord, as we go through each day, as we face trials and tribulations, Lord. Let us not forget who you are, and let us continue to seek all the more closely to be with you. In your name, amen.